discuss is how to pronounce our last name, which we both do differently.
You're taking it over. Well, you have J.M.
Right.
And you have DeMatteis.
Right.
What's the correct pronunciation? What do people call you if they come up to you at a booth?
There's a reason why I'm a mentally troubled person. It's because I have two different first names, and you can pronounce my last name many different ways. I'm not going to get into the first name thing. That's too confusing, and it will reveal all the dysfunction of my childhood. But the last name is the official Italian pronunciation is DeMatteis. It got Americanized and squashed into DeMatteis, which is kind of how it was when I was a kid. It was always DeMatteis. And but my father always used to say, but it's really pronounced DeMatteis. And as I got older, I thought, the Italian pronunciation is so much nicer. So I've been trying to convert over the years from the Americanized version to the Italian pronunciation. But Cody uses the other version,
I'm just lazy.
And my daughter uses the Italian pronunciation. So it's like everybody's, kind of like bouncing around. We have the same name and we all pronounce it differently. So
I'll switch.
Okay. Why don't you pull that a little closer?
Prior to your love of comic books, what else would you cite as early influences? Music, movies, television? Let's stay away from comic books for the moment.
Early influences. When I was about, I think, 6 years old, which when looking back is way too young, I saw my first Twilight Zone episode. And I think it changed my life. And I realized in retrospect, looking back, because I saw something on television that really sort of reflected the way I view the world. And I often wonder whether seeing the Twilight Zone created my worldview or reflected my worldview that I already had. Because that really is the way I see the world. I see the world as this place that looks very mundane and very normal, and yet you just turn one little corner and something pops, and you start moving to all these other levels of reality where things are much stranger and magical than it seems. So Twilight Zone was a huge influence when I was a kid. I read a lot.
What authors specifically?
I'm trying to think. As a kid, by a teenager, I was reading Dostoevsky and Herman Hesse and Kurt Vonnegut and Dickens and Isaac Singer and all this stuff. But as a kid, it's probably everything from Doc Savage to I remember being obsessed with the King Arthur stories and all that stuff that kids read. And probably when I was a teenager is when I discovered Ray Bradbury, who remains, along with Dostoevsky, one of my two favorite writers in history. I was a musician, so I was very influenced by music. I was in the 5th grade, which will date me, when the Beatles were on the Ed Sullivan Show, and that completely changed my life in so many ways. And that too, was not just about great music. That was about mind opening and shifting one's perspective on the universe. Being a kid, growing up in the 60s, and I was too young to have really been the 60s, but I was just young enough to be totally influenced by all that stuff. And the whole worldview then was very much like that Twilight Zone worldview, that the world was a very strange, scary, but magical place, and there were all kinds of things lurking beneath the first and second layers of reality. I call that the skin of the world. We see it as the skin of the world. We walk around, or the CNN reality that they're trying to feed us every day. This is what reality is. This is what life is. And then you poke beneath that, and there's a whole other thing going on. And I think I kind of tumbled to that pretty early in life. And then by the time I was 16 or 17, I was completely immersed in that perspective in a lot of different ways.
I think too there was so much more media to discover. There was less channels of arrival, more things that were kind of surprising. So it's dense now, and you find what.
Well, I'm not following what you're saying.
That's fine then.
No, that's okay.
I just mean in terms of the places at which you could find things like the Beatles. You have less channels.
We were talking about this last night.
That's what I was getting into.
That's what you mean by less channels.
Yes,
literal
channels.
Understand each other. What were there? 3 networks and a couple of radio stations. So the Beatles could come along and literally transform popular music. One band could transform popular music across the board because popular music was one solid thing. You could turn on the radio, there'd be the Beatles, the Beach Boys, there'd be soul music, there'd be Frank Sinatra, there'd be like Steve Lawrence and Edie Gourmet, and they would all be on the same station because that was pop music, so one band could do that. Just the way, Lee and Kirby could change comics, bang, just like that. There weren't a lot of channels.
Yeah.
And now, you know, you could have somebody come along probably just as revolutionary, but, you know, you'd have to go look for the YouTube channel over here, or you know, everything is so specific. We create our own little bubbles to imbibe our popular culture now. And, you know, TV, I think about like Star Trek, which is something else that really I loved as a kid and still love. That was canceled for low ratings in the 60s. Well, now to be a hit TV show, you can be considered a hit TV show with 1 million viewers, you know. I'm sure Star Trek had 15 or 20 million viewers when it was canceled, you know. So the whole way we imbibe popular culture is so different now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just think it's so granular now. There's no major channel of
Yeah,
input.
granular is a great way to put it, because it's like little grains of information everywhere, which is great because we can take in so much. And as other people pointed out, it's awful because we can also wall ourselves in and only allow in information that we want. You know what I mean? We can just go to that one news channel that tells us what we want to hear and listen to exactly the music that we want to hear. And so, you know, if you turned on the radio then because you liked the Beatles, but you ended up hearing Marvin Gaye, and you went, oh, this music is really great, you know? Now you can just have, there's literally, you know, Beatles radio that you can get on your computer and just listen to the Beatles all day and never have to let another thing in, which is kind of fun and creepy at the same time.
What would you say the first moment that you realized, before you worked in the industry, that it was possible to be a creator in the industry? You realized that people made this, and you wanted to
you know,
do it.
I think I always loved comics. I say this, and I honestly don't remember a time when I didn't read comics. Now, someone must have given them to me somewhere, but I don't remember. They were just sort of always around. Maybe my parents bought me one, and I went, oh, this is great, buy me another, you know. And I have a vague memory of a cousin giving me what seemed like 1 million comic books. It probably was 15 comic books that I laid out on the floor and just stared at for hours. And I used to love to stare at the covers. I didn't even have to read the story, just to stare at the covers. The covers were stories in themselves, which I think is an art that's gotten lost. Now, so many covers are poster covers, and they're really beautifully made and beautifully crafted, but they don't tell a story necessarily. And a lot of these old covers would tell us. You could look at that cover and imagine an entire story just by looking at it. So I always loved comics. I always read comics, and I was always creative. So those two things went together. I used to draw all the time when I was a kid, and with those covers, I'd sit on the floor with a Batman cover and freehand, you know, draw the cover. And I used to write stories. And then I became, after the Beatles, I had to have guitar lessons, so I became a musician and started playing in bands. So I was always being creative. But in my world, I grew up in a working class family in Brooklyn. So the idea of knowing somebody that was creative or artistic and made a living at it, there was no such thing. I had one friend who had a brother who played in like a lounge band in Las Vegas. That was the closest I came to knowing somebody that made their living being creative. And I think one of my relatives had a relative who was a sports writer for the Daily News. And since I had no interest in sports, that didn't impact me in the least, you know. So the idea of, even though very early on, I think probably as a teenager, I knew that I would never have a 9-to-5 job in my life, and I never have, other than an occasional temp job for 2 days. It was like a really big wall, the idea that one could go out and make a living being creative. And then, you know, as comics kind of shifted and the creators from behind the scenes, and Stan really did this, put them in the spotlight, and that's when you get the realization that these are real people that are doing this, and maybe if those real people do this, I can do this. It seemed impossible, but God was very good to me in that He made me very good at a few things and terrible at everything else. You know what I mean? So I didn't have a lot of avenues. I was just going to be a rock and roll star, or an artist, or a writer, one of those things, you know. And nothing else was on the table. I wasn't going to be an accountant or a lawyer or a teacher or anything else. So and so I had from the time I was young, a really bright passion for, not for comics specifically, but that I knew I would do something creative in my life. And I see that that's really, in the end, more important than even talent, is to have that passion. Because I've seen people with a lot of talent that don't have the passion, and they don't do anything with the talent. I've seen other people that maybe the talent part is wobbly, but they're so passionate about it that they keep at it and at it and at it. I had a friend that was a lead guitarist in a band I was in, and when he started out, he was not only not a great musician, but not remotely a natural musician. And he worked it, and he worked it, and he worked it because he really was passionate about it. And he became a really good guitarist and a very important part of our band, you know. And I think that's so important to have that passion. I think that's, 60% of the game is passion, and 30% is talent, and 10% is the sheer grace of the universe, Was there something else I was heading toward here before I got lost?
No, that's fine.
Okay.
No, it's funny too because I
see, if someone else interviewed me, they couldn't be cynical, they couldn't be rude, but he can be anything he wants to be.
I have leeway. I was just gonna say because for me, I grew up. There was always creative people, especially in the comic book industry.
Right.
I grew up with Galen, her dad Dan Green. It's these things where I was always exposed to it.
Right, he was surrounded by creative people that had done it. And the house was filled with them.
Free comics. Yeah.
But here's a question for you.
Yeah.
Did that make you think, oh, this is easy to do, or did it intimidate you?
It intimidated me, I think. I mean, because I always knew that.
So you can't win.
Yeah, you can't win. No, I'm definitely not destined for that. I think that it was always being exposed to it so thoroughly as a kid. It was just like, well, I guess this is what I should do. I didn't want to go be an accountant. Why bother?
We used to joke that you were going to grow up to be an accountant just because of that. He's going to rebel, but he has nothing to rebel against, so he's going to become an accountant. I hope I'm not insulting any accountants in the room.
I think they're at peace with their accountancy. You talk about drawing.
Yeah.
Did you ever think that could be something
I
you might
did when
try
I was
to
a
do?
kid. Although I liked writing, and I remember being like 9 years old and looking through the yellow pages because I wanted a publisher for my novel, which I hadn't written, but I decided I would write one. But drawing was my first passion, and I actually got accepted to the School of Visual Arts. I realized now that was a really good thing, but being a dumb working class kid from Brooklyn, I got accepted to the School of Visual Arts, and my parents' response was, "We can't afford that." I didn't even know there was such a thing as student loans or anything like that. That's how ignorant I was, and my parents certainly didn't know. So I went, okay, I guess I'm not going to the School of Visual Arts. And so I ended up going to community college instead, because that was $25 a semester. How's that? So I think sometimes if I had pursued that along with the writing and developed artistic, because I think if you're a writer-artist, why would you want to do anything but comics? Do you know what I mean? If you have those skills and you can completely tell the story in words and pictures all by yourself, and that's why I'm so in awe of artists. Every time a new piece of art comes through, I look at it because the idea that you can just take a pencil and create that on a page, to me that's still one of the most exciting parts of doing comics, is just when the art comes in and you see you've created something and someone has translated into these visuals, and the really good artists do it in a way that it looks like it was no work whatsoever, I've worked a lot with Mike Plug, and Mike is one of the best artists and best storytellers on the planet. And every time he'd email me a new page, and I would write back and I'd say, "This looks just like Mike Plug." This is because it did. And I was always so excited because the kid in me that was reading Mike's comics, when I was a teenager or whatever, was just as excited seeing the pages when we were working as collaborators. So I'm still in awe of artists, and I often wonder what would have happened. Or maybe I would have gone to art school and discovered that, because sometimes I look at some artists that they go through a whole career and they sort of never rise above the mediocre. And would I have just been a really mediocre artist, and it's a good thing I did what I did.
What other jobs besides comic books did you hold down before comic books became a full-time thing? And I know not
never
a ton.
really held down much of it. I had this one job at the Brooklyn College bookstore. That might have been the longest job I ever had.
And that was how long?
It might have lasted for a few months here and there. They used to hire people when the semester would start. They'd hire people to come in and you'd work all day and all night selling textbooks. And then I think I got hired long term. But I hated it. And that was the thing I knew from the time I was a kid. Was that, oh my God, how can I possibly spend 8 hours a day doing something I don't like? So we ended up losing the bookstore job because a bunch of the guys in my band we all worked in the bookstore, and last minute we got this gig at Max's Kansas City, which was a club in Manhattan. And I think it was during the rush, so they expected us to be there all day, and we had to leave in the afternoon, and they were like, "If you leave now, you're fired." So we kind of went, bye. And probably that evening, what we made on that gig, if we walked out with $15 each in our pocket, but it was worth it, because I didn't want to have that job in the first place anyway.
Then how did you get to your first published work from there?
My first published work was actually rock and roll journalism.
Sure.
Yeah, I did reviews and interviews and things like that for a lot of smaller papers and a little bit of stuff for Rolling Stone, and I just started submitting stuff. I'd write up some samples and I'd send it up here, which is what you have to do when you're starting out. You just write stuff and you send it to people and you hope somebody will read it and respond to it. I didn't make a lot of money because doing rock and roll journalism, but you got lots of free albums.
You still don't make a ton of money.
Right. You made less by the time you were doing it.
For me, it was for just free tickets, really.
Right. I would get like $5 a review, but you get free albums. There was this great club in New York City called The Bottom Line. It was a really nice, intimate little club. And so I'd go see anything there because along with the fact that it was great music, you got dinner for free. You got like a $10 tab and we'd get some great food and we'd sit there and hear great music. So who could beat that? Free music and free food, and then they'd print my words, So that was a great thing. But at the same time, I was trying to make inroads in the comic book business right around the same time.
Okay.
Should I talk about that?
Yeah, I was only going to mention that I think there's still a Grateful Dead review of yours on that they put up to the online zone.
Right.
Which got you some press.
I did a review for Rolling Stone of a Grateful Dead album, and I had a lot of friends, including my ex-wife Cody's mom, who were really into the Grateful Dead. As rabid as the most rabid comic book fans are, that's how rabid Grateful Dead fans are, and maybe more. You know what I mean? And I actually kind of liked the Grateful Dead, but the whole shtick that went with it always used to drive me insane. So I reviewed this album, and I have to say it was kind of a snarky review. And the positive stuff I had to say was about their keyboard player, who was somebody knew he wasn't one of the iconic members of the band, so the people hated that too. And usually as a reviewer, I tried, even if I didn't like an album, to balance it by saying something nice or positive. I think I went a little too heavy on the snark on the Grateful Dead review. I'd have to reread it to really see. Maybe it's more innocent than I remember it. And then a few weeks after it was published, because I'm thinking I'm just an idiot with an opinion like everybody else, and I've been writing for smaller papers, but I forget this is like Rolling Stone. People read Rolling Stone. People pay attention to what's in Rolling Stone. And I get this envelope from Rolling Stone filled with letters from Grateful Dead fans. And it was as if I had written something highly personal about their mothers. You know what I mean? They were so wounded. And they were either wounded, and I remember one was like, "Why are you saying this?" That was the tone of it, you know what I mean? It was like, they were so hurt, and then other people were angry, and it was like, and it really made me step back and think about the impact of my words, and it also made me realize that, I love opinions. I can sit in a room with people and have the most obnoxious opinion in the room and talk all night. That's fun, that's just between friends. But publicly, it carries a whole different weight, and I don't want to be the guy, I realize, sitting there criticizing other people's work. I'd rather be encouraging other people's work. I want to be the guy who's creating the work. And you want to criticize me, then God knows I've had plenty of that over the years, and that's fine. That's the nature of the beast. But that really solidified for me the idea that I want to be the creator, not the guy dissecting the creative work. And that's another path that I think, had I gone on there and then moved on to the first feature story, and what would I have done from there? But I'm so glad I didn't, because I don't think that would have been the right path for me. And clearly it wasn't, or we would be sitting here.
Sure. And then first published work in comics, how did that come about?
I started at the bottom. In a business that was viewed at the bottom.
You're supposed to start at the bottom.
But I really started at the bottom. Actually, the very first thing I ever sold, which really didn't get me anywhere, but I knew a guy in college who worked in Marvel's production department. And he had sold something to a magazine called Crazy Magazine. Does anybody remember Crazy Magazine? It was kind of a mad knockoff. And not the kind of stuff I really had interest in doing. And but he said, "Oh, you should try to submit something." So I did. I wrote something and I submitted it, and they bought it. And I got a check with Spider-Man's picture on it. It was like the coolest thing in the world, But I will say, of all the work that I've ever done, I've saved everything. The only things I've never saved were those issues of Crazy Magazine, because I actually found it, which is, because I think if I was young, I'd probably be happy to have it now. I was kind of vaguely embarrassed by it, It was like a Crazy Magazine, And people say, "Oh, I sold something. What was it?" "It's a Crazy Magazine." I was like, I remember one piece was, what if comic strip characters were real people? That kind of stuff, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And there was a little comic strip, Dondi, who was a Korean war orphan, and Dondi was like chained to a fence with, Pinko Go Home spray painted on. It was terrible. And I feel very grateful to, the editor's name was Paul Lakin, who was a very nice man, that he bought like more than one thing from me was like astonishing to me. But the coolest part was getting a check with Spider-Man's face on it. Couldn't beat that.
At that time, what did something like that net you, if you remember? What was it?
I have no idea. If they paid me $25, I have no idea. It was nothing. But that didn't get me any inroads with Marvel Comics, you know? So it was just like I sold a couple of things to Crazy. The only thing it allowed me to do was when I pitched some stuff to DC was to say, well, I am published, you know, I've been in Crazy Magazine. But at least I was published, you know. I'd made some attempts before that. When I was like 18, I had sent some sample scripts into Marvel and got a really, really insulting letter back from an assistant editor telling me how terrible I was. But, which wasn't the nicest thing to do. And then I made an attempt around the same time with DC. DC had an apprentice program in the 70s, I guess, where they were going to take in a group of people and train you to be comic book writers and artists, which was really a cool thing. But at least there, the feedback I got was actually very helpful and very constructive. And I think David Michelinie broke into the business that way. But now, you know, we're some years later, and so I wrote up another bunch of samples and I sent them into Paul Levitz. No, not even to Paul Levitz. I just sent him into DC Blind. And I had a Superman script and a Plastic Man script and this original thing of mine called Stardust, which actually had to really evolve into Moonshadow eventually. And I got back a letter that said, you know, we won't buy Superman stories from somebody we've never heard of, but Paul Levitz is buying material for House of Mystery and Weird War Tales. I had a whole line of anthology comics at that point, which I had never read and hardly even heard of, because, you know, I was reading the mainstream Marvel and DC stuff. And so I ran out and bought a bunch of House of Mystery and a bunch of House of Secrets and Weird War Tales and all that. I mean, Weird War Tales. It's like starting at the bottom again. Here we are back at the bottom, Weird War Tales. And I wrote up some pitches and I sent them into Paul. And I saved the letter and I sent this letter to Paul some years later. I copied it and sent it to him, where he tore my plots to shreds, just to shreds. And insulted my typing, because this was pre-computer. And he said, I almost had it memorized, I suggest you use a typing service or learn to type more slowly, because the physical presentation of your work leaves something to be desired. Which it did, because I was like, I'm going to send this thing in. And then you draw in the corner and you put little scripts and write things over things, you know. But the important thing was, well, there were two important things. The most important thing was at the bottom, he said, but please feel free to submit again. So when you're starting out, you know, you're not listening to your work sucks and you type badly. It's like, he said I can try again, you know. Somebody else might have just gone, oh, he didn't like my work and slunk away. But no, I was not going to do that, so I sent him some more stuff. And the other thing is that someone pointed out to me years later that Paul took the time to tear my work to shreds. He could have just, you know, I could have gotten a form letter back that said, you know, sorry, your work does not meet our standards, goodbye.
You could have got nothing back.
Yeah, or nothing, that's right, which, you know, happens.
It's more common now.
Yeah, and it certainly happens in Hollywood, you know. So the fact that he took the time to do that really speaks volumes about Paul and who he is. So I sent him some more stuff, which he picked apart, and I was living in Brooklyn at the time, and DC's offices were in Manhattan, and I said, oh, well, can I come in sometime and just pitch in person? Which I thought that would be fun. And I went in one day and sat down with Paul and pitched him a bunch of ideas, and he took one of the ideas and he started breaking it down on a piece of paper. Well, this would be your splash panel, and this would be this. And my little brain's going, he's breaking this down. He wants me to write this story. He's gonna let me write this story. It was like the greatest thing in the world, you know. And I went home and I wrote it in a white heat, and I went back in, and Paul, of course, corrected all the things like the fact that I didn't put a splash panel in the story, you know. I still have the other piece of paper I still have from the beginning, all these little rules that Paul wrote down, which was like 35 words per panel, no more than 35 words per panel, no more than 5.5 panels a page, things like that. It was really, and I would go home and count all the words in every panel, and if anyone knows my work, they know that I don't do that anymore. Especially if you read the stuff I do with Keith Giffen, there's, you know, I'm definitely not counting the words in the panels. It's like, let her fit it in, you know? But it was a great way to learn. It was an 8-page story with a beginning, a middle, an end, and a plot, and character arc, and all this stuff. And, you know, 5 to 8 pages are what these stories were. You know, now someone, the way, with the more decompressed style of storytelling, now someone would take that 8-page story and do it in like 16 issues, you know. But it was a really fantastic way to learn the craft. So I went back in, and then Paul literally shook my hand and said, welcome to the business, when he bought the story. And it was like, that was like one of the greatest moments of my professional life. You couldn't beat that, you know. It was really wonderful. And I did that for about 6 months, and then there was something that some of you might remember called the DC implosion. They'd expanded the line at a time when the market couldn't bear it, and everything kind of collapsed, and they cut back to bare bones. And so the first people to go were the new people, so suddenly there was no work. And I didn't really get regular work for like another year. Sure. At the same time, I was making some inroads at Marvel. I'd sent some stuff to Jim Shooter. I also, as being a journalist, I'd written some articles about the comic book business, so I got to interview Shooter and the people at Marvel in DC, so that kind of helped them get to know me a little bit. And so I think I might have gotten a fill-in at Marvel or whatever along the way. But then it was about a year later that DC started to get up and running again, and I started writing for Time Warp and House of Mystery again, and then I started working with Len Wein, who became my mentor in the business. He was the first guy who kind of looked at my work and said, you know, you're not just another guy wandering through here, you have something, and I want to help you develop that. And to this day, I'm profoundly grateful to Len, because he really changed my life in a lot of ways. And he was looking for a series for House of Mystery. And he said, I have a title for you, I, Vampire. Go home and create something. So I went home and I created I, Vampire, which amazingly is still around all these years later. I also went home for Weird War Tales and created Creature Commandos, which maybe is not quite as highly regarded as I, Vampire. But, you know, those are the first two things I ever created in comics were I, Vampire and Creature Commandos. Because, you know, they were hard. I said, well, they want a series for Weird War Tales. Okay, it's a war and it's weird, monsters, World War II. Okay, Creature Commandos, you know. So, and so I did that for a while, and then this is where you're going to come into the story, actually. Because he was born in 1980, and in 1980, Len Wein offered me the job of his assistant, a staff job. At the same time, Jim Shooter offered me a freelance contract at Marvel. So this is like a choice that was a very delightful choice to have, you know what I mean? I know who would ever thought that it would have reached that point. And because of my relationship with Len, I pretty much decided to accept the staff job at DC. Except I had this new baby that was just born at home, you know what I mean? I remember my wife going, but what about the baby? and I went, yeah, no, I want to be a stay-at-home dad. I want to be home with my kid. So I took the freelance contract with Marvel and went on with it from there. So that's another one of those places where the river, you know, sort of splits. And well, what if I would have stayed on staff? Would I have gone on to an editorial career? Or would I have hated it and quit and done something else? Who knows? Sure. That's how I started. Bless you.
At what point did you feel that you wrote something that kind of embodied what your voice is? Because Weird War Tales, maybe
right.
not.
Right.
What do you get? What is the
with
first
those early stories, all you're doing is learning the craft. Finding your voice is like a whole other thing. It's, you know, and there's not a way to teach somebody how to find your voice as a writer or as an artist or as a musician. That's just who you are. But finding the way to express that is really difficult. And then comics, especially then, when most of what you were doing was for mainstream Marvel and DC, you know, the creator-owned stuff was just starting to creep in. So you get in, and all these characters you've been reading since you were a kid, and I want to do my version of that story that I loved, or I want to write this story about what happened between panels 2 and 3 of Defenders number 14, you know, and you're sort of imitating, at least I was, I shouldn't say everybody, imitating us, you know, this, you know, the imprint from Stan down to, say, Len, to Steve Gerber, to this one, to that one, you know, everybody sort of got, you're imitating everybody else's voice and you're not really finding your own voice. And then I did a story, Marvel had a black and white magazine called Bizarre Adventures, which lasted a couple of years. And in a screenwriting course I'd taken, because that was another path that I knew I wanted to take eventually, I had this idea for this weird sort of comedic horror story called Greenberg the Vampire. So I pitched it to Denny O'Neil, who was editing Bizarre Adventures, and he said, oh, this is great, you know, and I had the whole story because I already had it worked out for the screenplay. So Steve Leoloa did the art, and I did this Greenberg the Vampire thing. And after it was published, I was up in the office, and everybody was like, hey, that's really good, that was a great story, it was a really good... They weren't saying that about my other work, you know? And I was like, what is it about this, you know, and why this? And I realized it's because I had stepped outside of the Marvel and DC universe. I had stepped outside of Stan Lee's voice, and Len Wein's voice, and Steve Gerber's voice, and all the people that had influenced me. And I was just writing for the first time in comics as myself. And it was an incredibly liberating thing. So that was the first sort of door opening. And the thing that really, really did it for me, though, was Moonshadow. Yeah. Because that was when, you know, the industry started to really, really change. And suddenly DC had stuff like Camelot 3000 and Ronin, and Marvel started the Epic line. And I said, well, you know, it's a lot of fun writing Defenders and Captain America and Marvel Team Up and all that, but I want to tell my story. I want to get in on this. This is great. The creativity in the air in that era was incredible. There was so much freedom and so much creativity. And I had had this Moonshadow idea for years. And what happened was, I think my contract at Marvel was up at that point. And Karen Berger at DC, I pitched her Moonshadow. Here's another divergent path. And she said, oh, come do it for us. There's this new artist, Dave Gibbons. I'll get him to draw Moonshadow. So in some parallel universe somewhere, there's a version of Moonshadow written by me and illustrated by Dave Gibbons. The other thing that happened, the other book they offered me then was because Marty Pasco was leaving Swamp Thing, so they offered me Swamp Thing. If I had said yes, there'd have been no Alan Moore Swamp Thing. So there's another weird divergent path. And of course, he would have just faded into obscurity and we never would have heard of him, you know? But so Shooter said, well, if you want to stay, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to do Greenberg the Vampire as a graphic novel. Because I had pitched that and they said no, but because I was now negotiating, they said yes. So I did this Greenberg. And I want to do this thing called Moonshadow. And I gave him the outline and he read it, and to Jim's credit, he didn't throw me out of the office because it was pretty weird. He said, sure, that sounds like it's an epic comic, so go do it for Epic. And through the grace of God and an artist named Dan Green, I found John J. Muth, who was just like the most extraordinary artist you could ever work with. I mean, and Moonshadow turned out to be the first fully painted comic book published by an American publisher.
Because you didn't conceive of it as a painted book?
No, I didn't conceive. And this is where the magic of comics comes into it. The story as I was conceiving it had a very almost a kind of a Kurt Vonnegut, sort of a harder edge and maybe a more cynical but compassionate tone a la Vonnegut. Although I had all these Dickensian elements that I put in there, in chapter titles like I Am Born and all those kind of David Copperfield things. But I find Jay goes off and does some sketches, and he comes back with these sketches. And I said, wow, this looks like something out of a Dickens book. And he went, yeah, well, that's what you wrote. And until he said that, I went, oh yeah, that is, isn't it, And in looking at Jay's sketches, that's what helped me find the voice. Because I had to raise my game because he was so talented. And then, and that, for me, the whole key to writing is finding the voice of that particular story. You can have a story for years. I had a story called The Life and Times of Savior 28 that I developed literally for 25 years, and then had the whole story worked out. And then I sat down to write it, and I went, I don't know what I'm going to do, because I didn't know what the voice was. How was I going to tell it? What was the narrative perspective? And so looking at Jay's art helped me find that voice. And then Moonshadow someone asked me last night, well, what was that about? Where did it come from? And I think it just came from the sheer giddy, creative freedom of being allowed to do a story that was all mine in my own way. There's a quote that I always quote, and the sad part is, A, it's probably not the quote because I've mangled it so much by now. And two, I don't know exactly who said it. I imagine it was Ray Bradbury, but I've looked everywhere and I can't find it. The basic idea is to treat everything you write as if it's the only thing you will ever write in your life. And to pour everything that you think, everything that you feel, everything that you are, every bit of philosophy that you have, your entire perspective on the universe into that piece as if you'll never write again. And that's what I did with Moonshadow, And because of the era, the 80s, and this being epic comics, no one said no to us about anything. The only no we ever got was that in an early issue we had an expletive, which I will not mention because there are children in the room, and they made us take it out. And by a couple of issues later, they said, who cares? Go ahead, leave it in. And that was the only thing they ever said don't do. And they basically backtracked on that. We were completely free to tell the story in our own way. And in the course of working on that, I got to work with Jay. Kent Williams stepped in and helped us. George Pratt stepped in. Amazing artists bringing the story, to life. And that's the thing that really liberated me as a writer. And let me say one more thing. And then when it was time to step back into the Marvel Universe, I had so sort of expanded my brain that I think maybe the first thing I did after Moonshadow from Marvel was Kraven's Last Hunt, which I never would have been able to push that as far as I did had I not done Moonshadow or pushed that so far.
You mentioned Savior 28,
yeah.
And we've talked about like long incubating ideas, things that sit, things that were originally pitched for a character X and end up with character Y. Savior 28 was originally Captain America?
Yeah, in 1983. I've been writing Captain America for a couple of years, and I did this year-long story. It was his final showdown with the Red Skull. Everybody that Captain America knew and loved had been threatened and almost killed by the Skull. His whole world was falling apart. And finally, at the end of it, the Skull dies. He got better too, just like they all do, And the journey that I wanted to take him on after that, because I'm thinking, this is a guy that's been around since 1940, and it was now the 1980s, the Reagan 1980s. He's a smart guy. He's got to realize by now, especially after this horrible thing he's been through, that there've got to be better ways to live than punching people in the face and dropping buildings on their heads and solving problems with violence. So I wanted to take this Marvel icon and have him question basically the fundamental beliefs of the Marvel universe, and he was going to basically walk away from being Captain America, and he was going to still be Captain America, but not in that way. He was searching for another way to be. And there was an old Kirby character called Mr. Buddha who was going to kind of become his mentor. And what was going to happen was the rest of the guys in the Marvel universe were not going to be very happy about it because he made them look bad, basically. Like, what is the matter with you, And the government was not very happy because here's Captain America saying, violence might not be the answer and war might not be the answer. No. And it built into this very, very interesting and complicated story that ended with the Bucky of the 50s flipping out and assassinating Captain America. And then I was going to have another character of mine, a Native American character called Black Crow, become the new character, Captain America. And my editor, Mark Gruenwald, God bless him, said, let's try it. Let's do it. And I started, I wrote a few plots, and Jim Shooter got wind of it and said, oh, no, you're not. And which at the time, I was like, oh, that's it, I'm quitting the book, I'm done, furious and all that stuff, how dare he. And, with time and perspective, you realize, hey, that was his job. His job was to caretake not just Captain America, but the whole Marvel universe and decide what would work for the characters and what wouldn't. I think it would have been a really great story. I think it would have been incredibly, really ahead of the curve and ahead of its time. It would have gotten a lot of press. And didn't they assassinate Captain America 20 years later or whatever it was, But that was the end of that story, and I just took it, and then I said, well, maybe if I create a new character. And so I created a new character, and I pitched it somewhere, and they didn't want to do it. And over the years, I would just, every 5 years, I'd return to it and mess with it and finesse it and pitch it somewhere, and then no one got it, they didn't understand it. And then, remember, we started in 1983, it's now 2009. And I'm friends with an artist named Mike Caballero, a wonderful artist. And he sent me some of his newest work, which had been very Kirby-inspired. And I said, wow, you would be great for this thing, Savory 28, read it. And he read it, he said, oh, I want to do that. And I had been in touch with Chris Ryle at IDW, which I have to say is a wonderful company to work for. And I said, Chris, I have this idea, and here's some art from Mike Caballero, and here's the outline, and I sent it to him in the morning. And that afternoon is the only time it ever happened in my life. They said, okay, it's approved, let's do it. So it took me 25 years to get a one-day approval on that project. So that's why I always say, the old cliche, never throw your ideas away, because don't throw your ideas away. I had a project with Mike Clue called the Stardust Kid, which I had originally conceived of 20 years before that. A Badza took at least 10 or 15 years before I found a way to get it out in the world. So it's really, really important to if you're a creative person, you never know when that idea will come back. Ideas have, stories, I believe, are alive. Stories have their own method of getting out into the world, their own timing. It's like, there's our timing and God's timing, or there's our timing and there's the story's timing. And you can wrestle with the story as much as you want, but there's a certain point where you have to step back and respect the story's timing. And, but who would ever thought I'd be sitting around for 25 years waiting for that story to figure itself out,
I think it's also good to jump to Kraven, because we talked a bit about that in terms of its early incarnation.
Right, so there's a perfect example of a story that I had my own ideas for, Kraven's Last Hunt, and the story was like, no, we're not doing that, and that, how the universe sort of came together to support that. Kraven's Last Hunt started out as an idea for a Wonder Man miniseries, believe it or not. I remember there had been some story where Wonder Man, we discovered that Wonder Man actually couldn't die, he would just die and then regenerate and come back. And I thought, what would happen if that happened and it took him 6 months to regenerate? And 6 months of his life had gone by and been robbed by his brother, the Grim Reaper, who was this supervillain, And I pitched it to Tom DeFalco, and he said, I don't like it. God bless him for rejecting it. So I thought, okay, well, there's that. And I thought about it some more. And this might work really nicely, this idea with Batman. Maybe the Joker kills Batman. And I worked up this whole story where the Joker, the Joker kills Batman. Same exact thing. Buries him in the ground. But what happens with the Joker is, by killing Batman, his life's goal has been met, and he snaps and he goes sane, And I later wrote that story 10 years later for Legends of the Dark Knight called Go Insane. And DC rejected that. In fact, I did 2 versions that DC rejected twice. So and then I got offered a Spider-Man gig again on Spectacular Spider-Man, and I said, oh, this is my last chance, you know? And of course it turned out that Peter Parker was the perfect character for that. And he just got married, so the emotional resonance of the relationship with Mary Jane. But even then I wasn't using Kraven. I had this new character I was going to create. And then I randomly opened a Marvel Universe handbook. And someone had this little piece of information, and it was Kraven, and it said he was Russian. And I love Dostoevsky. I thought, Russian, I can do this whole Dostoevsky in a riff with the tormented soul and good and evil and duality. And that's how Kraven came into it. Then they brought in Mike Zeck to draw it, and we created this character Vermin, so I brought that in. So again, it took years for all these pieces to come together. And at the same time, I was at a very, very, very low, wretched, miserable point of my life. So all that misery and angst and pain, that's why that story still, I think, has resonance for people, because I felt like Peter Parker. I felt buried 6 feet under, you know, crawling up out of the grave, and all that honesty went into the story. But that was this, had it been up to me, I would have written a Wonder Man miniseries that no one would have even remembered 5 minutes later. But the story worked itself out.
Was there any reaction to the severity of the story? Because you didn't really see anything with mainstream superheroes that was that.
No, that was probably the darkest Spider-Man story that had ever been done, and no one at Marvel said boo about it. They were happy to do it. And in fact, not a period or a comma in that story was changed. It was exactly as I conceived it. And the only problem we had was that some people wrote to Marvel after Kraven's death to say that they thought we were glorifying suicide, which we weren't. It was pretty clear that Kraven was out of his mind. He thought this was an honorable death, but it wasn't. You know, he was crazy. His last line is, "They said my mother was insane." Boom. You know. So, but that's what led me to do. We did a one-shot sequel called Soul of the Hunter that addressed that whole issue. So I would like to actually see them collect that together with Kraven someday.
Get away from dark to light to kid-friendly stuff. The Badza. What would you like to see that resurrected as again?
Yeah, Badza is a series that I wrote. The Stardust Kid originated because when he was little, I wanted to do a story for him, and that took 20 years, so it was too late. He was grown up, you know. And Badza, I'd had the idea, but I thought, and my daughter was about 7, and I thought, I need a comic book I can read with my daughter. And there was nothing, you know. So I pitched that, eventually sold it to CrossGen, little knowing that by the time I sold it to CrossGen, everybody in CrossGen was in a swamp up to their neck and sinking fast, you know. So by 3 issues in, they killed that. Then Disney came along and bought it from us, and we did a book series for Disney, which they killed after 3 issues, you know. So there's probably no project in my entire career that I'm more emotionally connected to than Badza, and I'm actually talking to somebody at Disney right now about a possibility of resurrecting it and bringing that back. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed on that.
I mean, the different forms. Would you want to see that as a comic book? Would you want to see that with throws?
You know, all I want right now, because I learned my lesson, I just want to finish the story. You know, we had signed for 8 books for our Hyperion books for Badza. We were talking about doing 12. It was our big epic that killed it after. I actually wrote the 4th book, but they killed it after 3. So I just want, what I want right now is give me 1 book, prose with some illustration, and let me finish the story. And if that does well, we can do more. You know, but I want to finish the story. Yeah. Should we do questions? Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
So I haven't really seen too much of your television work, but I've read years and years of your comic book work.
Right.
So because you're free, and sometimes you crowd in those panels, those words, and television and film, they kind of, you know, you're boxed in by timing. Do you get notes saying, you know, cut down the dialogue, and how do you work those notes?
No, because I wouldn't write a television script the way I would write a script when I'm working with Keith Giffen. You know, it's like it's a different animal. And you know, I've written novels, I've written for TV, I've written film scripts, and you have to adjust your brain to the form. You know, you know, and in the beginning, like with anything else, there's a learning curve. And in the beginning, my scripts are always too long. So then you learn that you can't write a movie script and it can't be 160 pages. It has to be 110 or 120 pages. So you learn to cut everything out. But I never had a problem with the dialogue. The biggest difference should be, and with TV especially, and it's even more so in movies, I think. But in TV, you can't. In comics, there's a lot of freedom. These days, not as much as there used to be, but there's a lot of freedom. And especially if you're working on create-your-own stuff, you're doing it the way you want to do it, exactly the way you want to do it. in the past 8 or 9 years, I've done a lot of animation. So I'm not going to walk in to write an episode of Batman the Brave and the Bold and announce to everyone, this is my vision of Batman the Brave and the Bold, and no one change a word. It doesn't work that way. You're part of a team, and you go in knowing that you're part of a team, that you're going to write something, and you're going to get notes, and you're going to change it, and you're going to turn that in, and you're going to do a draft of this, and you're going to change that, and then once they've approved it and it's done, the story editors will change something, and then the directors will decide there's a whole new sequence they want to put in, and they're going to change something. So you have to really check your ego at the door. The guys that have the freedom in TV are the guys that are producing the shows, and it's their show, and it's their vision. If you're a freelance writer hired in television, you have to go in as part of the team, or you really shouldn't be doing it. So what I do is I put on a different mindset, and then it's fine. Because then they're going to tell you to change this. And sometimes I've seen episodes of things that I've written where it's virtually every word that I wrote is up there on the screen. And then I've turned on other shows and I went like, oh, there's a word. And it still says, written by J.M DeMatteis. That's the weirdest part, you know what I mean? It's like they change everything. And I've had scripts where they've changed so much, and they love working with me. Because it turns out they didn't change it because they didn't think the script was good. There are production reasons why it got changed, or the budget went over, and they had to cut this, or they had to do that. So it's a very strange business in that way, But I've really enjoyed it, and I will continue to work there. But the one thing that comics has to offer is a level of freedom that you can't get a lot of places as a writer. If you're going to write a novel, yeah. But even having written novels, I see the editorial process with like a HarperCollins, and you've got like the editor and copy editors and all these people sitting there hunched over your work, ready to find the one period that's out of place, And in comics, I've had so much freedom to do what I want exactly the way I want to do it, and I'm incredibly grateful for that.
Can you talk a little bit about, I know in comics the scripts can be totally different. Some are just outlines and others are really detailed. Can you talk about a little bit about your style, maybe how it changes?
Well, yeah, sure. There are two different ways primarily the comics are done. One is what they call Marvel style, which is plot first, and the other is full script. Now, plot first has a very weird reputation because people hear the stories of Stan Lee in the 60s saying to Jack Kirby, let's bring back Dr. Doom, and that was the plot. And Jack would go home and draw the whole story, and then Stan would dialogue it and brilliantly and write his own story on top of Jack's story. But that's not what plot first is about. Plot first is very, very detailed, sometimes page by page. And I went through periods where I would go, it was almost a full script, page by page, panel by panel, suggested dialogue. But the beauty of plot first is you don't put that final dialogue in until you get the artwork. And the best example of that I always use is a story I did in Spectacular Spider-Man 200 with Sal Buscema, a brilliant artist. And it was the death of Harry Osborn. And there was a very big, melodramatic scene at the end where Harry dies and Spider-Man gets into the ambulance with him and he dies in his arms and Peter has to tell Mary Jane, Harry's son, and all this. And I knew in my head that I was going to schmaltz this up. I was going to just like pour it on captions and thought balloons and everything else, And I got Sal's art for the last 3 pages, and I looked at it, and he captured everything that I put in the plot was there on the page, and I didn't put a word on those pages. And that's the beauty of plot first. When you're writing full script, you're in control of the whole thing. Page 1, panel 1, camera angles, what's in the scene, captions, dialogue, you're pacing the story, and so it's more like, actually, it's even more detailed than writing a screenplay. It's very, very specific. And even then, the artist, 3 different artists will illustrate that story, and it will come out 3 different ways. But that's the fundamental difference. We only have a few minutes. Let's see if we can couple more questions.
I'd say mention your workshop, maybe.
Oh,
that was very informative.
That's a good idea. That's right. Let me just say one thing. One of the things I've been doing the past couple of years with people that are interested in writing is I do these writing workshops called Imagination 101. And if you go to my website, J.M DeMatteis, or J.M DeMatteis, whichever you prefer,
spelled the same.
It's all spelled the same. There'll be information about the workshops. I also have an editorial service where I work with people one-on-one on developing their work, which is a lot of fun for me. Someone will send me a piece of work, we'll get together on Skype, we'll go over their stories, and it's been a lot of fun for me to take all this knowledge of the past 30 plus years and apply it that way. Now we can do the next question.
So 5 minutes, I'd say one more.
We talked briefly yesterday about Brooklyn Dream.
Yeah.
I'm curious about I know some of that was autobiographical.
It was basically all autobiographical. I changed the names partly to protect the innocent, and partly because I found that by lying, I didn't have to worry about every detail being right. I could write it as I remembered it. Yeah.
I was curious about what the process of seeing that brought to life by Glenn Barr was like, I don't know, spiritually for you in processing?
What was extraordinary about that was that I had visuals in my head of how I wanted Brooklyn Dreams to look. And it started, before it went to Paradox, there was a Piranha Press at DC is where I originally sold it. And there was a guy named Mark Nevelo who ran that press. And he said, let me show you some samples I have from this guy, Glenn Barr. And I looked at Glenn's work, and it was exactly what I saw in my head. And every time I gave Glenn something, he either gave me what was exactly in my head or he made it even better. I mean, the fusion, one of the best compliments I ever got in that book was a writer who said, you know, I always thought that the only people that could really reach the top notch in comics is if you're a cartoonist, if you're writing and drawing it. And he said, this book came together as if it was one mind writing and drawing it. And it really did. And you can't create that. You can't make it happen. It just happens. And Glenn Barr is brilliant. And we were just meant to do that project together. And it remains one of the 2 or 3 projects that I'm the most proud of in my entire life. You know? Oh, we'll take one last question. You could.
So, you created Dr. Ashley Kafka,
Yeah.
Spider-Man. Just came back, it's killed off.
Yeah.
What do you think of how it was done?
I actually didn't read the story, so I've read about it, but I didn't read the story. I think Dan Slott, I have to say, is a fantastic writer. So if he did it, I'm sure he did it well. Since I've killed so many characters that belong to other people, I can't really, oh God, they killed her, you know? You know, so what's to complain about? You know, I don't, you know, it's fine with me. And this is comics. She'll be back. They all, you know, I killed Aunt May. She came back like in 15 minutes, for God's sake, you know? At least, you know, Kraven stayed dead for like 25 years. Harry was dead for like 20 years. Aunt May was like, I'm better now, you know? So that kind of stuff doesn't bother me, you know? Or if it ever bothers you, it bothers you for like 3 seconds, and you realize it's comics. Get over yourself, you know? So, all right, this has to be the last one because they have other people coming in.
Beautiful hardbound edition of Moon Shadow.
I would love to see that. And I was just, well, I can't get, someone suggested that idea to me, another publisher, not the publisher that's publishing it now. So, you know, if things ever reach a point with DC where it's no longer viable to keep it there, because I don't see DC doing it right now. But I would love to see a big, oversized hardcover edition of Moon Shadow where you could really have that art breathe and really see it, you know, like the true art that it is, you know. And I think that's it, because we have other people coming in. So thank you.